Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. In turn I'll usually suggest armor and trinkets that allow for high damage, and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. That usually also means that the build is not necessarily always the best in slot choice, but it will pass a certain DPS threshold under the usual raid buffs and get you through pretty much all open world content on your own if needed. Today's class is the Revenant and the elite specialization is the Vindicator. And we're going to talk about 3 different builds, 2 different open world roaming variants and a power DPS variant for group content. Now before we go into the details of the build, let's talk some pros and cons. First off, the build has good and bursty damage, with around 34k on the golem with a very easy rotation. You can further increase that DPS by using a huge hitbox or power infusions. On top of that, the build has a very unique playstyle in open world that is comparable to a bouncy ball, because when you do it right, you can dodge infinitely. The build also has good utility options, because it's camping greatsword and that frees a weapon slot, and it uses the dwarf stance. A downside of this build is that it requires you to get a second set of armor for open world because it relies on fireworks runes there. Also, the unique dodge mechanic of Vindicator is not always advantageous because dodging defensively costs you damage. And finally, the build relies on allies to grant you vigor, and depending on large hitboxes isn't always good. Now let's go through the general playstyle of Vindicator. The main change that comes with the elite specialization is that your dodge becomes a high vault into the mists with a drop down after around 1.5 seconds. What happens on the impact depends on trait choices, but generally your dodge becomes an essential part of your damage, similar to Daredevil or Thief. Most of the time we'll be using the trait Forerunner of Death that grants 15% increased damage on dodging for 15 seconds. In consequence, you want to dodge at least every 15 seconds to maintain this buff in combat. You'll also be only able to dodge at full endurance, so less than you're used to. To be able to dodge every 15 seconds, you need a quite high endurance regeneration rate, so Vigor is a pretty essential boon for this elite specialization. Alternatively, you can use Energy Melt for it, which is a skill that comes with the elite specialization and converts energy into endurance. It's not really worth the cost usually though, so I only use it when I need an emergency dodge in open world. It's easy to see that the dodge mechanic on Vindicator has a clear trade-off. Dodging is an essential defensive tool for most builds, but here you have to use it as part of your damaging rotation and your dodge is available less frequently. This means that it can happen that you won't have your dodge available when you need it. So you have to look for other ways of preventing incoming high damage attacks or CCs. We'll be going through the options you have for that later on. As weapon choices, you have several different options for Vindicator, but let's be honest, if you play a Vindicator you have to use a friggin' greatsword. Anything else is subpar, at least in terms of fashion and roleplay. While you can get a little more damage by adding 2 swords to the rotation, it increases the complexity of it noticeably and comes at the cost of other utility options in the same slot that are often very handy. That's why I typically run a staff on the off-bar in group content to be able to provide strong CC whenever it is needed. As the 2 legends of choice, we'll be using the legendary dwarf and Shiro stances. Now you might ask, what about the legendary alliance stance? I found the skills included in it quite lackluster. They don't really do lots of interesting things, and as a DPS open world roamer, having to flip between them was often more annoying than actually helpful. And in terms of DPS, using the alliance skills isn't really much of a DPS gain. To show an example, Nomad's Advance does 20% more damage than Mists Unleashed, but costs 4 times as much energy. Sure, it adds some might and is a leap finisher, but that's not really worth it in terms of raw damage. This unfortunately applies to most of the alliance skills that you'd consider for damage purposes. So I went with both Shiro and Jealous, which provide much more utility, less intense energy management and close to the same damage. In general, I think these skills, particularly the Archimedes ones, can use more flavor to synergize better with the core specializations on Revenant. Now let's start with the weapon skills on Greatsword, since it is the main weapon. The auto attack chain is pretty standard, it applies a bit of vulnerability and does good strike damage. What you'll notice is that the damage does increase from the first hit to the last, but it's not that backloaded. This means that you don't really have to pay much attention to letting your auto attack chains finish, especially since all other skills deal more damage than a single hit of the auto chain. One of the skills you absolutely want to use off cooldown is Mists Unleashed. It also applies 3 stacks of vulnerability on cast and does a lot of damage. I usually try to pair every second cast of this with Phantom's Onslaught since the cooldowns line up pretty well. Phantom's Onslaught is skill number 3 and it's a charge ability. It's a shame it isn't a leap finisher, but it's still worth a cast since it's quick and does good damage. It also applies chill, so it provides some soft CC. Skill number 4 is Imperial Guard, and aside from your dodge, this is your main defensive tool. It blocks incoming attacks for a time and allows you to cast the riposte skill True Strike. The damage of the riposte increases with each hit that is blocked. With a fairly short cooldown on this, you can use it frequently to avoid high damage hits or generally fare well in situations under high pressure. Finally, got Eternity's Requiem. This skill is the highest damage skill in your kit, so you absolutely want to use this off cooldown. This skill unfortunately also scales with the hitbox of the enemy, since the hits applied randomly in a circle around you. So the larger your enemy is, the better this becomes. This is also why the benchmark on Vindicator is done on the huge hitbox, but that is not really realistic in actual content. In fact, the largest hitbox found in raids, for example, is much smaller than the huge golem hitbox. Moving on to utilities, as I've said before, the legends of choice are Chalice and Shiro. Starting with Shiro, the healing skill is Enchanted Daggers. This initially heals you and then siphons health a few times on your next attacks. This doesn't cost a lot of energy, so it's a really good option to heal yourself when you need it. After that we have Impossible Odds. This is an essential skill for the damage you deal. It's an upkeep skill, so it will drain your energy slowly while it is active. It makes all your strike damage hits apply a secondary hit after a short delay, with a quarter of a second cooldown. It also grants you 50% increased movement speed while active, which is nice for general mobility in combat. The next two skills aren't really used much because they cost a lot of energy and don't have a lot of offensive benefits, especially in group content. It's worth noting that riposting Shadows is the only stun break you have on Shiro, so in case you get CC'd and can't do anything else, and have 30 energy to spare, use this to break free. You also don't really want to use the elite skill Jade Winds because it costs 50 energy, so probably all you have, just for a CC skill and some vulnerability. You have much better options for CC, so avoid using this if possible. The second legend, Chalice Iron Hammer, is generally less damage focused than Shiro, but grants a lot of utility and survivability in return. It's still a really good option for damage too, so the trade-off is definitely worth it in my opinion. The healing skill is Soothing Stone. It's a great heal, a Condi cleanse, and applies Resolution, which will reduce incoming condition damage in the solo build, so what's not to like? In the second slot I typically put Vengeful Hammers. This is another upkeep skill that does great damage, heals you, and also reduces incoming damage by 20% while it is active. More on how to use this later in the rotation section. The next two skills in Chalice are great tools for open world and group content. Forced Engagement is a powerful CC tool that applies both soft and hard CC. It's great for breaking CC bars in open world, especially when combined with Aspiring Reinforcement and shield applied from weapon skills. This way you don't actually need a staff to provide enough CC to break hero point bars. It connects you to a target with a chain and makes the target deal less damage to you as well, so that's also pretty cool. Next up we have Inspiring Reinforcement. This is a ground AoE that is very handy in many situations despite its high energy cost. It provides pulsing stability to allies, which is great, especially in fractals. It also does damage, is a lightning combo field for Eternity's Requiem to apply additional vulnerability, and as a cherry on top, it weakens foes. The elite here is an emergency button that reduces strike damage taken by 50% for you and 4 others around you. Don't use this unless it's absolutely necessary, as it costs a lot of energy. Before we move on to the gear, I'll also briefly touch upon the staff skills. Particularly Surge of the Mists is worth mentioning, staff skill number 5. It's one of the strongest CC tools in the game and evade and costs comparatively few energy points. This alone is worth putting a staff on the off bar for group utility. Staff also provides another block through Warding Rift, an AoE Condi cleanse, and some self and group healing, which can be handy in cases where things get iffy. Moving on to gear. The gear I suggest for Vindicator violates one of the axioms I set for these guide videos, but getting at least a second set of armor for Vindicator is basically necessary if you want to do both open world and instance content, unless you have legendary heavy armor anyway. For group content you should run full Berserker with Scholar Runes, since that will put you to exactly 100 precision if you have both Spotter and the Warrior Banner and maximizes damage you deal. In Fractals you don't even need those two buffs to reach 100%, at least if you have Mist Potions. Since ArenaNet has announced that they might change Warrior Banners to grant boons, maybe instead of the unique effects they have, you might need around 5% additional crit chance to reach the cap after that change. You can either get a few Assassin's pieces, slap on an Accuracy Sigil, or swap to Precision Food. The latter is probably the easiest way since it grants exactly as much precision as the banner does. The same applies if you don't have Spotter in your subgroup. For open world I suggest to run a different set of armor with Knights on it. Knights gives you enough toughness to survive pretty much any encounter while retaining 2 of your major damage attributes. If you have legendary armor, a bunch of stat selectable exotic armor pieces, or want to have a more effective distribution of stats, I actually prefer commanders over knights for the extra boon duration and major attributes on power and precision. It's not really needed though, so don't buy it from the TP directly since it's quite expensive. Why do you need a second set of armor? Because it allows you to slap a rune of fireworks on it. These runes are pretty perfect for Vindicator. Vigor and Fury are the two essential boons for the build, and increased movement speed, might, power and boon duration are great to have as well. You'll understand why I emphasize Vigor and Fury in particular later on when we talk about traits. For the weapons, the build uses 3 in total, 2 greatswords and 1 staff. The 2 greatswords have different sigils, since one of them with force and impact will be the overall main weapon, while the one with force and stamina will be used for open world roaming. Especially the stamina sigil is so much fun in open world because it will refill your endurance on every kill that rewards experience. This is the reason why Vindicator is a bouncy ball in a lot of open world content with endless dodging, because you constantly keep killing enemies. So you're going to use double greatsword in open world and a greatsword and a staff in group content. Let's move on to traits, specializations and consumables. As always, I won't go through every trait in detail, but rather mention only the ones that define the playstyle of the build. We'll always be using Invocation and of course Vindicate. In group content we'll also always use Devastation, while in open world it depends on whether you want some additional survivability or not. Starting with Invocation, the traits here are pretty much set in stone. Invocation with the traits of choice grants you increased strike damage while on more than 90% health and while having Fury. It also grants you Fury on swapping legends and disabling a foe, 5 stacks of might whenever you gain Fury, and most importantly, doubles the crit chance you get from Fury. Especially Roiling Mists should never be changed, since it grants an effective 420 precision. I don't think I've seen any other trait give that much of a single stat with such an easy to fulfill condition. As the second core specialization, we'll be using either Devastation or Retribution. Retribution is the option for more survivability, so whenever you're alone and want to do solo champion hero points or bounties and that kind of stuff. This grants you 25% increased endurance recovery, projectile block and pulsing weakness around you on using a heal skill, vigor on evading attacks, more damage against weakened foes, applying weakness to disabled foes, less damage taken while you have resolution, and 370 healing per second while you keep up impossible odds or vengeful hammers. The reason why I suggest this is that it provides reliable healing from steadfast rejuvenation, additional soft CC and increased endurance recovery, meaning more dodges and easier times to break defiance bars without much added complexity. Devastation is the second option for open world and a must-have for group content. Throughout the entire trait line you have a whole bunch of damage modifiers. You have both a 20% modifier against targets with high health and with low health. You deal more damage based on the number of vulnerability stacks, and also gain additional power for every stack of might you have. For general open world roaming you can use this, since especially unsuspecting strikes grants you more burst damage, so that your dodge will often one-shot weaker enemies, refilling your stamina sigil so that you can dodge again. If you want to provide group utility for power-based subgroups, you can swap Notoriety for Assassin's Presence, since that will increase group DPS at a cost of around 1k DPS of your own. If you want to balance it for survivability without giving up unsuspecting strikes, you can also use Dance of Death, since your dodge, first attack in combat, auto attacks and Mists Unleashed apply stacks of vulnerability that will cause you to siphon health. In group content you always want to run Notoriety and Swift Termination, since they provide by far the highest damage. Finally we got Vindicator. I already explained the dodge mechanic before, so let's just go through the traits. First off, Leviathan Strength will increase your damage by 10% while your endurance is not full. So make use of your dodges ASAP. They are absolutely essential to increase your damage. Next up, I always run Song of Arboreum. This makes Vigor stronger on you, so it increases endurance recovery by 75% instead of 50%. Paired with the 25% from Retribution that we've seen earlier, the Tanky open world build will be at the cap of 100%, so that's very nice to have. Having Vigor is essential to be able to dodge often due to Forerunner of Death, a trait I've mentioned before. This and Leviathan Strength combined make your dodges on cooldown give a whopping 25% damage increase. The actual number depends on whether that is additive or multiplicative. In the Tanky open world variant we'll be running Vassals of the Empire. This makes your dodge apply 10 stacks of might and 11.5 seconds of protection with fireworks runes. This allows you to maintain easy 100% uptime on protection, decreasing incoming strike damage by a whopping 33%. You need survivability, you go for this. Also the shield this applies is pretty neat when paired with weakness, and it increases the boon duration of all boons active on yourself and allies around by 2 seconds, which is also great in group stuff. In any other scenario, run Forerunner of Death. In terms of consumables, I always run Power and Ferocity Food and the Ogre Sharpening Stone, since that provides the highest damage. In the final part of the video, I wanted to give some advice on the rotation that I use in group content. The rotation is designed so that it creates nice burst damage at the beginning, especially relevant for open world and fractals, and maximizes the uptime on both Forerunner of Death and Leviathan Strength. In essence, that's very easy to obtain, dodge pretty much on cooldown. But there are still some things that you want to keep an eye on while doing that. For the opener, you want to start in Shiro and dodge. Right upon landing, activate Impossible Odds and then use Eternity's Requiem. After that, use Greatsword 2 and 3 and swap to Jealous. In Jealous, use Vengeful Hammers and then again Greatsword 2 and 3 on cooldown. You can try and track your auto attacks while doing this, but it's not a big deal if you don't. Now, Eternity's Requiem and dodge should be available before you can enter Shiro again, so that you can dodge a second time, cast Eternity's Requiem right after, and then immediately swap to Shiro and use Impossible Odds. After that, just using Greatsword 2, 3 and 5 of cooldown and swapping back and forth between Jealous and Shiro while keeping either Vengeful Hammers or Impossible Odds up. It's better to try and dodge more in Jealous and use Eternity's Requiem in Shiro because Vengeful Hammers keep dealing damage while dodging. In Shiro, Impossible Odds doesn't do anything while you're dodging, so you could technically disable it while doing so and reactivate after, but that's a bit annoying and often leads to more problems than it solves. Eternity's Requiem creates a lot of hits in a short duration, which is why you want to ideally use it in Shiro to get a few more hits of Impossible Odds in. It's not that big of a deal if you don't get it in this way though. It usually lines up pretty well with dodging, so that you can just dodge first and then cast Eternity's Requiem right after. Over the course of fights, you'll see DPS decrease between 80 and 50% due to unsuspecting strikes and swift termination, since you miss the 20% damage amplifier from them for this time frame. In terms of prioritization, dodge always comes first, for reasons I already mentioned. Big damage. The weapon skills are prioritized based on their damage as well, of course, and Eternity's Requiem is by far the strongest contributor to that per cast, so that is priority number 2. Even on small hitboxes, by the way. Then Greatsword 2 and 3, and lastly auto attacks. Overall, the rotation is pretty simple and forgiving at the cost of some single target damage, but it's a good all-rounder build for pretty much all encounters with a ton of cleave damage, utility and survivability packed into its kit. Also note that this Golem Parse is done without infusions, which usually add around 2-3% damage to it as well. Alright, that is it for today. I hope that this video was insightful for you and made you want to bounce all day. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy bouncing!